Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Brendan Hauser with EVOQ Bike, another World Tour rider that really doesn't need an introduction. Jack Haig from Australia is on the podcast today. You've seen him on the podium at the Vuelta. You've seen him crushing big races. He's with Bahrain still. This guy loves training and he loves keeping it simple. And just the amount of information that he distilled in 45 minutes, I thought was incredible. I'm definitely going to go back and listen to this. Everything from the gym to his bread and butter workouts, altitude training. He's calling in from Tenerife from camp. Made time for all of us, went a super busy schedule. Talking about the upcoming races, he kind of sticks to this race program and he has it all laid out up until the tour. So, Jack, thanks so much for doing this. Tons of gems, everybody. Hit him up on Instagram. He posts his races on Strava, and check out his podcast. Just search his name on Apple or Spotify, wherever you stream your pods. Good luck with your training racing. We'll talk to you later. See ya.
We're here at like 2,100 meters.
Okay.
And it's kind of the only place you can do altitude training in this sort of time zone at this time of year.
So what's the temperature like in centigrade or Fahrenheit, whichever you're, I guess, centigrade?
Yeah.
I'll do the calculations for most of our listeners.
So right now, sitting in the sun, it's probably like 15 degrees up at 2,000 meters. But when we go down, it's depending on the day, it can be 25 degrees.
Oh, wow.
So like most days we leave with like leg warmers on, rain jacket, a buff. But then by the time you descend down, we climb back up the mountain with just shorts and a jersey and an undershirt, basically.
That sounds amazing. It's not, yeah, it is. Where I'm at in North Carolina is freezing cold. So anybody talking about bibs and a jersey, I'm super envious of. So you guys do you always go down to train? Are you just sleeping at 6,000 or are you also going up above that? Could you go in? We'll just roll into this and then we'll do an intro because I'm really curious about this. What's the sort of protocol of this camp?
So it's a little bit different because we have a race coming up next week or this weekend. So in 5-6 days, and we will spend only a total of 12 days at 2,000 meters. Okay. And that's about as high as you can get. So there's a bit of a plateau at the top up here between 2,000, 2,300, where you can kind of do, like today we had a hour and a half recovery ride, and then all of that is done at about 2,000 meters, but you can't really go any higher than that. So then for a majority of the training, we descend down the mountain and then make maybe like a little loop around the bottom of the volcano and then climb back up to get back to where we're staying. And then to extend the altitude, so we're here in Tenerife, we fly back to Valencia in mainland Spain. We do the one-day race on the Sunday, and then we go to a hotel which has altitude simulation. And then we spend another, I think, 9 days in this hotel. So in total, we'll get about 22 days of altitude stimulus, but 12 of those days are at real altitude. And then 9 of those days are at simulated altitude.
So a couple questions from that. If you could say there was 3,000 meters available, would you guys go higher? Or is there something about 2,000 where you can still do work if you're trying to do efforts? Or what's the thought there?
Well, there's not actually that many locations you can go that much above 2,000 meters in Europe. So you've got like Stelvio, you can stay at the top of that. And I think off the top of my head, it's about 2,600. But it's not like in America where you have like some places in Utah or somewhere like this that you can actually get quite high. And it's just, I think if we could choose, we'd probably like to sleep at about 2,400. But yeah, anything above 2,000 is more or less okay. And like I said, the location that we're at now in Tenerife on Mount Data is more or less the only place we can get above 2,000 meters with it being relatively reasonable weather.
And then the simulation, is that just when you're sleeping, or are you guys hanging out in a room, like in the bedroom still, and just, hey, stay in your room until we're riding, just soak this up as much as possible, or what are you guys doing there?
To be honest, I've never used this hotel that we're going to go to now, so I'm not 100% sure on what the protocol will be, but I imagine it will probably be trying to get at a minimum 10, 11 hours in the room. So that's probably like 2 hours outside of those sleeping hours,
Mm.
2 to 3 hours outside of the sleeping hours. Because obviously we'll still be spending 4-5 hours outside riding, and then you don't have that many hours once you're also probably eating meals. We're probably not going to eat in the room. We'll probably eat that in the restaurant, and then you just have maybe 11 hours you'll end up spending in the room.
Cool. Awesome. All right, let's do what we should do from the start. Let's do a quick intro for the couple people that might not know who you are. Give us an intro. Let's plug the podcast straight off the bat too. You have a podcast going, so let's what the name is of that, how people can find that, and who are you?
All right, I'm Jack Haig. I'm an Australian road cyclist for Bahrain Victorious at the moment, and I'm 31 years old. I've been a professional now. I think I'm coming into my 10th year professional. I have a podcast, which is called The Rest Day with Jack Haig. Gets distributed through the Escape Collective podcast channel, and you can sort of go there and listen to it. I interview a bunch of my friends who are professional cyclists, and also just some people along the way. Like, I'm in the process of doing one with the coach that's overseeing the altitude camp, which I'm currently at the moment.
Awesome. Who's the so people can look forward to that episode? What coach should they look for, and who is that?
His name's Loic Segat. He's a Belgian coach. He actually has a brother called Alec Segat who rides for Lotto Destiny, or actually forget the name of the team this year. It's changed. It's no longer Lotto Destiny. But he's quite a good time trialist. So his brother Alec is quite a good time trialist, professional cyclist, and then Loic he's quite young. He's 26 years old, and he's in the second year coaching in Bahrain. And I'll have a bit of an interview with him talking about what we're doing here at altitude, a little bit of his philosophies on training, and then there's a Discord channel that Escape Collective have, and then people have submitted some questions there.
Sick. That's awesome. Everybody be sure to look out for that one. Go subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast. So with this camp, what are you trying to get out of this personally? Or maybe it somehow involves the team's goal, but it's early season for you. Could you just talk about, like, where is this? Are you coming out of base? Is this part of your base training? It's kind of a really wide open question, but just to sort of kick things off, like, people are probably wondering, like, oh, what's Jack doing over there?
All right, so I probably started training for this 2025 season around the middle of November. And then we had one training camp with the team for 2 weeks in December. And that was kind of the first get-together training camp where you do a lot of media, you do a lot of medical checks. And then now we have this training camp in Tenerife at altitude. And the idea is to get sort of the first altitude stimulus for the year, because I'll probably end up doing 2 more altitude training camps after this before the Tour de France, and then maybe one after the Tour de France before Vuelta a España if I end up going there. And the main reason that we're here now is, to get that first stimulus, to put down a lot of good work while we're here, because at the end of the day, we're always doing a lot of vertical meters. We're staying at the top of a volcano, essentially. So every single day, we basically climb back up to 2,000 meters. We can descend right down to sea level, and then every single day to get home, it's 2,000 meters vertical.
So what are you trying, if you had to pick one thing, what are you trying to improve on most this season? And I'm curious too, does your viewpoint towards improvement change as Mitch Docker said, oh, he's in the later part of his career. I don't want to be the guy who's like, oh, he's kind of like towards the end. I mean, you're only 31. But what are you still trying? Do you look at it as like, hey, I'm trying to improve on this? Or are you trying to not get slower at things? Like, how do you view this upcoming year?
No, I always seek improvement, but it's definitely getting harder the older I get. And it's maybe less about improvement and more about refinement, and just getting better at doing the things that I've done in the past to hopefully see a little bit of improvement, because I'm no longer at the point in my career where you're seeing improvements that are quite large in power numbers, for example. Those things are quite minute. I've sort of tapped those areas out, but the areas that you can refine is like, how can you execute training a little bit better? How can you execute the recovery a little bit better? How can you provide slightly different stimulus to see if that does provide an increase in performance somewhere. And it's not necessarily about trying to add 20 watts to your 20-minute PB power or something like this, or 20 watts to your 5-minute PB power. It's more about just trying to refine everything down and use some of the experience you've taken from, or the experience I've taken from all the years of being professional of, okay, this is not my first time I've been to Tenerife, and it's not the first time I've done altitude camp. What's worked for me in the past? What hasn't worked for me? How do I make this one hopefully give me the best possible improvement?
I love that. Can you talk more about the executing training? What have you seen since maybe your first 2 or 3 years as a pro versus now you look back, you're like, wow, I thought I was doing it right, but this is like, I've learned this tactic for my training. 'Cause I think that could be applicable to so many riders.
I think my career is sort of spanned across mostly it's probably in nutrition. So my career has spanned quite a bit across the low carbohydrate phase we went through, probably in the mid 2015 to 2018 sort of time. And then the sort of maybe post-COVID era, 2020 to now, where the carbohydrates have been really pushed. I definitely spent quite a bit of my first year professional under fueled. And I think that's probably a common thing that if you speak to a lot of people that were pro in that period of time and even before that period of time, but especially in that period, there was a few nutritional studies going on, especially through the AIS, the Australian Institute of Sport. The most famous one was the Supernova study done with Louise Burke. And they were studying the low carbohydrate diet on Olympic race walkers. And they initially were seeing some good evidence behind it. And then I was riding for Greenwich at the time, which is an Australian team, and they had quite a big affiliation with the Australian Institute of Sport. And through that, we were pushed quite a bit to try and experiment with low carbohydrate diet. And now I think we realized that that's not the way forward. And I probably, sacrificed some of those first couple of years in my personal performance because I was trying to experiment with some low carbohydrate stuff. And that's the biggest change I've probably seen in my training, I would say. I did an interview with Dan Lloyd and GCN a couple of days ago talking about this, exactly like training and how it's changed over my time. And I said to him, I don't think much has changed in the basic fundamentals of training. It's like that it's about doing work and then recovering from that work and then doing the right amount of intensity at the right times. But the thing that's maybe changed is now there's more specificity there and there's more ways to quantify those efforts and make them more purposeful maybe than they were before. Whereas like an example I gave was still 10 years ago, we were still doing threshold days, but it might have just been, okay, today the threshold day, go and ride the climbs around your house at threshold. Whereas now it's like, all right, it's like do 4 by 10 minutes. And this is the watts you've done because we did the lactate testing in December training camp. So then we can prescribe it at this amount. And then we retest the lactate in 3 months time. And then we can re-prescribe the threshold power targets in the future at a more accurate and more quantifiable way.
Which do you personally like better? Go ride the climbs at threshold or do X watts for wide duration?
No, I enjoy having the science behind it all, and I enjoy learning, and I think you get better improvement and also better reassurance that you're doing the right thing. Because maybe in the past it was go and do all the climbs at threshold, but maybe you were actually doing them a little bit too hard because you wanted to feel as if it was a maximal effort. Whereas now it's like, all right, I don't need to go to the maximum every single time I'm doing intervals. And I know that I'm getting the right stimulus at this power output because of all the testing that we've done.
That's awesome. When you talk about the nutrition side, just real quick, what do you do for grams of carbs on long endurance rides? You're just going out for a 5-6 hour ride versus a race day.
So I think it's very different from a professional to an amateur. For example, yesterday we did 6.5 hour endurance ride, but that was still, I think I finished the day with 5,600 kilojoules.
Mm-hmm.
And I know from personal experience, if I was to only fuel that with, say, 60 grams of carbohydrate, because that's maybe what people were recommended for just an endurance ride, at the end of the day, I'm getting nowhere near the amount of calories to be anywhere close to a caloric balance.
Mm-hmm.
And then I suffer so much the next couple of days because I'm in such an energy deficit. So in the end, I end up fueling at about 100, 120 grams an hour doing a 6.5 hour ride, because just the calorie expenditure for a professional at the end of the day, I think I averaged 230 or 240 watts for 6.5 hours. And yeah, if I fuel at 40 to 60 grams an hour, that's a massive calorie deficit to end up being in. And then that ends up being something that I end up paying for over the next couple of days. But then, yeah, to come back to the racing now is basically you wouldn't really fuel anywhere under 90 grams an hour. And it can go all the way up to 150. Like 2 days ago here, it roughly takes about 2 hours to ride from sea level back to the hotel that we're at. And then I did a little bit of gut training and I did 150 grams an hour for those 2 hours. So 300 grams of carbohydrate in 2 hours.
Cool. I like it. What are you eating? Do you have like standard things that you like?
So for example, in the gut training thing that I was talking about just then, I think I did 2 bottles of 30 grams of carbohydrate in the bottle.
Okay.
Plus 1 bottle with 90 grams of carbohydrate, plus 1 water, so 2 liters of fluid in 2 hours. And then I did 2 gels of 30 grams each. And then the team soigneurs, they produce these things that we call Rice Krispies, which is essentially just like rice bubbles with marshmallows.
Mm.
They're really good. Like you'll probably come to hear more about them because it's only sort of been the last 3 or 4 years that we started using it in professional cycling, because previously we used just a traditional rice cake, which was just cooked rice essentially. But then people were doing more research onto like the resistant starch and the fiber not really being absorbed, and the rice bubbles with marshmallows. They cut them up and put some fructose in there as well. So each sort of square is about 30 grams as well.
Cool. Awesome. I love it. So you had a couple 2-word statements that I thought were very interesting. You talked about different stimulus and do work. So when you think of doing the work, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit before, but and I realize this is a huge question. There's so much different types of work. But when you think of do the work, what is do the work to Jack Haig?
Do the work is probably it's just time on the bike. And I would say, like, if you were to summarize, I had this question in the Discord channel that I have for my podcast, and people were just asking like about training. And I said, I think you would find that most World Tour professional cyclists train between 19 to 26 hours on average a week. And I think that if you were training less than 19 or 20 hours a week, you would probably struggle to compete at a World Tour level. Or, yeah, I would say that there's probably a minimum amount of just like time on the bike that's required to compete at a World Tour cycling level. And then obviously you get to different degrees of refinement of what you are doing in that volume. But I think there is a certain amount of like minimum required volume.
Perfect. Love it. And in that, this might be a good segue to a question I'm always curious about. The 19 to 26 hours, do you do any strength training or gym work? And if
Yeah.
so, how does that play out preseason, season, whatever?
So I started cycling with a mountain bike background, and gym was pushed much more in mountain biking than it was in road cycling, especially now 14 years ago. So I've always tried to do quite a bit of strength training my entire road career. One, I think it is a little bit beneficial for performance on the bike, but I think it's also very beneficial for just longevity in the sport, but also in personal day-to-day life. Like I enjoy kicking the football around my son, or I enjoy going skiing or something like this. And I think having that foundation of strength training allows me to do those kind of activities and not get sore from them. And then the other thing that I think it really helps with is, as professional cyclists, we don't really do much else than ride a bike, and it can really be detrimental for bone density. And I think you see a lot of professional cyclists really suffer with bone density. So I always try to do the strength training, do a little bit of running in the off season to try and help that bone density, because once you kind of lose it, you don't really get it back again. And I don't want to be 40 with osteoporosis. So I always try to include that. But it's definitely getting more and more used in professional road cycling. For example, this year's the first year my team has a full-time strength coach employed, and he's writing programs for a majority of the guys in the team, and it's becoming a much more used training modality. And like, for example, the team now owns a couple of squat racks and stuff like this that they basically drive around to training camps, so that we always have squat racks and strength equipment to be able to do strength training. And depending on the athlete, depends on the type of strength program you're doing. But for example, myself, I'm mostly just focused on a couple of main movements. So one of them would just be the back squat. Another one would be like Bulgarian split squat, Romanian deadlift, and then maybe like a step up onto a box. And I personally like to keep it quite simple, quite basic, because at the end of the day, I'm not trying to really improve the weight that I can lift on the bar. I'm not a sprinter. If it doesn't really change probably my climbing performance if I lift 80 kilos or if I can progress that to 120. So a lot of it is more just about trying to have a good foundation of strength.
Love that. That is how what's the frequency, and does that change throughout the year at all?
Yep. So during sort of the preparation period, it's about 2 times a week. And then that slowly tapers off as we're getting closer to racing. And then also the amount of weight and the amount of reps also change as we get closer to racing. So obviously we're not going to be lifting, we're not going to be doing, for example, 5x5 back squat with relatively heavy weight 3 days before going to race. Mm-hmm. But we do this during the preparation period, and then the strength coach sort of periodizes the program depending on what we have coming up, both in training but also in racing.
Okay. So you've given so many amazing tips already of things that are helping you, execute training better and doing the work properly. As you look back over your career, on kind of the flip side, what are some of the things that you were like, ooh, that maybe not only didn't help, but maybe hurt my performance a little bit? And you mentioned the nutrition things. We won't go into that again, but any just techniques or things that it just didn't resonate with your body for whatever reason?
I think one of the biggest traps that we can fall into as professional cyclists or just professional athletes in general, is we always want to work harder. Mm. And it's not necessarily the thing that leads to better improvement. And a lot of the times at a professional level, the coach's job is to hold you back and to give you reassurance that what you're doing is enough. Because at some point you do cross the threshold where that stimulus is no longer useful anymore. But it's very easy to quantify and say, well, if 25 hours was good, why isn't 30 hours better? Because there's more work. Or if doing intervals 2 times a week, why don't I do it 4? And I think I've made that mistake in the past as well, of wanting to do too much work and then not actually leading to better performance and maybe even being detrimental.
Do you know, is there something that you feel that is like, ooh, no, this is the last session, I'm like pushing too hard? Or is there something that your coach says, hey, I'm seeing X, Y, and Z from what we've learned last year, Jack, let's just ease up for a minute? Or is it just a conversation? Maybe like, what is that thing that tells you guys, okay, we're good for right now, let's pause?
I think through experience, you start to learn a little bit just your general feeling on the bike as well. But also my partner at home is also a pretty good example of, like, she can generally predict if I'm starting to get a bit too tired, like all of a sudden I get a bit cranky at home, or like if something's not done properly, then I'm just like, I just like lose my shit at something, which in the end means nothing. Or even just like simple things. It's like, maybe my son's school is not that far away from the house, and I enjoy going for a walk to take my son to school. But then at some points I'll get tired from training, and that walk all of a sudden seems like a bit of a burden. I'm like, actually, you know what? I don't really feel like walking to school today with you. And then I sort of noticed when I start doing that for many days in a row that I'm like, maybe I'm training a bit too hard, because I don't have that extra energy just to do the basic stuff, like going for a walk, or going, if my son's like, oh yeah, let's go kick the football, let's go where, or my son has ski lessons, instead of being like, oh yeah, great, let's go, I want to go skiing with you, then I say, you know what, I'm a bit tired. And they're kind of the small little signals of just like general day-to-day life things that I notice when I start to get a bit tired.
I love that. That's so many people can use that in their own training. What do you think? Is there a cadence of when these recovery weeks are necessary? You know, everybody hears 3 weeks on, 1 week off. And maybe this changes as your season's going on. It's like, oh, well, we got this race in 4 weeks. I'm going to rest a little bit now because I want to ride before that. Or I realize big question, and maybe there's not a blanket statement, but how do you look at that in your head? Like, how often do you really need to recover? And what is like a rest period for you? Is it 2 to 3 days? Is it 5 days? Is it just by feel?
Um, I actually think it's quite hard to coach a world tour athlete because we do so many race days,
Yeah.
and it's very rare that you get so many big, like it's very rare you get a 4 week block, for example, that you could do a big consistent amount of load and say, okay, we do 3 weeks on, 1 week off, and then we have another 4 week block. So then we do another 3 weeks, 1 week on. We're constantly kind of like racing, recovering, and then trying to fit in a small amount of training between each race. But in the off season, you do get a bigger period of time where you can sort of map out bigger blocks and program in certain rest periods. But for example, before coming to altitude now, I had 5 easy days. And if I let me try and think about exactly what I did, I think I did. So the training block, I think I finished. I did a 7 hour endurance ride, and then I think the next day was maybe like an hour and a half easy. Then I think maybe I did 2.5 hours. Then I traveled, so then I had a day off. And then the first 2 days at altitude were again like 2 hours and then 4 hours, but with no intensity at all. So then there was 5 days, basically just endurance riding with one complete day off the bike. And then we restarted the next training block while we're here in altitude.
Okay. Love that. You mentioned endurance rides, which are probably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, probably the bread and butter of, you do a lot of them. We get so many questions from people after podcasts of like, oh, ask this guy, but what does he ride his endurance at? You know, there's so much in the past few years, and maybe it's from Tade and Inigo, but it's like, should I ride 60%? No, I should ride 72.4%. Like the magic number is actually 60. How do you, and are you still in Andorra?
Yeah, so I reside in Andorra.
Okay. Sorry, super hilly, right? Like this is always jumps in like, whoa, I live in a mountainous area. Do I ride easy up, but then I got to coast down, and people are telling me not to coast. How does Jack look at an endurance ride without me? You said simple before. I feel like you're going to have a simple answer, but maybe not.
Just don't overcomplicate it. Go ride the bike, and it should just be an endurance ride to me. It should just be an enjoyable ride. Okay, it's a long time on the bike. Mm-hmm. So it's, between 4 to 7 hours, for example. But it shouldn't be hard, in my opinion. Like, I know there's many different ways of doing it, and there's many different ways of doing training. For example, I'm quite good friends with Pavel Sivakov, who's in the UAE team, and he does his endurance rides ridiculously hard. And I do a couple with him every now and then, and I just say to Pavel, I said, but I got a lot of respect for you, but I personally just don't enjoy this. Like, it's just not very enjoyable for me. And maybe it's adding an extra stimulus to the way he's training, but at the end of the day, you also want to be able to do this for over a long period of time. Our careers can be 15 years long. Mm-hmm. And for me, an endurance ride is finding some nice roads, going for a little bit of an explore, finding a nice coffee shop with a cake and a coffee, and then coming home. And the stimulus is the time on the bike. Mm-hmm. And give a number, for example, an endurance ride for me can be anywhere between averaging 210 to 240 watts.
Cool. I was going to ask, what's that percentage of FTP in your head? Or do you not even think about that?
So we don't really work that much with FTP, but like, for example, I'm about 71, 72 kilograms, and how would you quantify FTP? Do you want 20-minute peak power? Do you want...
That's actually a very interesting conversation. So like threshold power is not really in the conversation between you and your coach very often. It's more just go at these watts.
Yes. And also I've now been cycling for a pretty long time that I more or less know the feeling of what threshold is, or what a zone 3 interval is. I know more or less what that RP is, what the heart rate is, what the power is. And it's kind of like a triangulation of all these things together that then that's kind of where I end up sitting at,
Okay.
or even in watts per kilo. Like I more or less know, like I need to hold X amount of watts per kilo for this duration for me to be competitive.
Super interesting. You're just the second guy. I talked to Will Barta back in November, and we haven't posted that one yet, but he was talking about, he's like, well, I kind of think of watts per kg sometimes. And he's like, I don't get it prescribed, but I just know it, and I know this
Yeah.
climb. And I was like, oh, it's so interesting. No one has talked about this, so maybe this is more a new way of thinking about it. That's how often do you do a 7-hour ride as opposed to a 4-hour ride?
Not very often. So
Okay.
a lot of the times, like a 7-hour ride probably only happens maybe max 8 times a year.
Okay. Oh, it's still,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So maybe once
Yeah.
a month when training, like that.
Yeah.
That's pretty solid.
Yeah. Yeah. It could be once a month, but yeah, it would be not so often that would happen. It would be kind of like a long endurance ride for me is anything over 6 hours. Once you start going over 6 hours, that's quite a long ride.
Cool. Okay. You mentioned the 7 a few times. I'm like, I wonder how many times he's doing these things.
No, that's all.
So people love to see the workouts that you are doing as a pro, and we always like to make these little images. Do you happen to have a banger workout in mind that maybe it's something that you like doing that's sort of sick, where you were like, this is going to be so freaking hard, or maybe it's something your coach gives you that you don't like, or maybe it's something that Pavel does that you're like, dude, I'm not even going to do that ride with you. Do you have a banger workout session that we could make to show people on Instagram?
I think just like a bread and butter interval that I've done for almost my entire career is just like a 15-minute zone 3 spiked workout. And you can break that down into many different ways, but basically that's a workout that hasn't really changed over my entire career. You do, yeah, zone 3 for say 2 minutes 30, then you do a 30-second spike quite above threshold, come back to that zone 3, repeat to make 15 minutes.
And how many do you do of those?
Maybe 2 to 3.
Awesome.
So like 30 to 45 minutes of total work.
Cool. And just out of curiosity, when you talked before about executing the train, is there anything that you're looking like, hey, I really want to be able to do this spiking, come right back into the tempo? Or is that overthinking it? Or is it just like do it by feel where you're like, hey, I'm out of the saddle, I'm back, I'm cruising, I'm like at a good clip? Or is there anything in your brain that's like, that was a good session, or something that might be like, nah, I didn't really execute that well?
It would probably be more the feeling. So it would be like, once I've done that spike and then I come back down to the zone 3, what does that feeling feel like? Do I feel like I'm metabolizing and clearing that lactate and I'm now comfortable in that zone 3? Or do I spend the majority of that 2.5 minutes still suffering a little bit? And how high can I push that zone 3 where I feel like I'm recovering?
And so is this, you said this is like something you've done over your career. Is it something that you do very often within the season? Like, is this along with endurance rides, like you're doing these spike tempo rides pretty often?
With my coach, we mix it up quite a bit. So it's not something that I would do all the time, and it gets broken down into many different ways. Like the other day, I did one that was not as aggressive, where it was more like 2 minute zone 3, 3 minutes threshold for 20 minutes. So that was a slightly less explosive kind of workout, but we do a lot of this sort of rhythm changes in training. So it's something that's used a lot, but it's not necessarily the exact same template that is used over and over and over again.
Cool. Keeps it fresh. Any VO2 max training that sticks out?
So yeah, we do in two ways. So obviously there's a lot of research now showing that more of the Tabata style on-off is a really good VO2 max stimulus. But something that I find living majority of the time in Andorra, and a lot of the training gets done at medium altitude, that my VO2 max power is actually quite a bit lower than it is at sea level. And we like to do steady state VO2 max intervals just to have that muscular stimulus of holding what would be the equivalent of like 6.5 watts per kilo at sea level. I can't do 6.5 watts per kilo at medium altitude for 15 minutes, but I can do it for 3 times 5 minutes, which is then in the VO2 max zone at medium altitude. So that makes sense.
So okay, so like classic 5-minute VO2, and if I heard you correctly, add a specific wattage at altitude that correlates to what you could do at sea level.
Yeah. And
Got
then
it.
obviously we also do then the very standard, like I think I have a session coming up, which is maybe 3 times 7 minutes. And those 7 minutes are broken down either into 30-30s, 40-20s, or 20-40s.
Okay. Which do you like better, Tabata or steady state?
Tabata, I think.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Neither of them are very enjoyable, which is why I hesitated there for a little bit. But maybe the Tabata.
I don't know why. For in my head, I thought like a GC guy would just like steady state, ripping solid power. But maybe the Tabata is more like real racing, so maybe that resonates with your brain. I don't know. That's interesting.
The steady state just always seems like this bit of like a more drawn out suffering process, whereas like the Tabata, it's more of a mentally easier interval.
Okay. My last question on this one, sorry to be so granular. Tabatas, there are some people that talk about them where, say they're doing, let's say 7:30:30s. They're going to go full gas on the first one, knowing that the watts are going to decrease. Or other people are going to go more, try and hit the same wattage across. Maybe you're doing it by RP, like, yeah, this hurts enough. What's your sort of flow through that series?
So if I needed to do 3 by 7 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
I would want each interval to more or less have the similar average power. So I don't want to do the first interval and go maximum, but then my last 7-minute interval to be 40 watts less than my first one.
Got it.
It's trying to get more or less the highest average power for the total work, if that makes sense. So like the highest average power for that 21 minutes.
Cool. So I'm like drilling you with watt questions, but maybe more importantly, what's more important? What's more important to you, aerodynamics or more watts in 2025?
So we have the option of 2 bikes in Bahrain, where we have a climbing bike and an aero bike. And the aero bike is roughly a 300-gram penalty to the climbing bike. But I race the aero bike probably 80% of the race days. So I prefer to be 300 grams heavier, but to have a faster aerodynamic bike.
How do your friends feel about that?
It's definitely taking longer for people to adopt that, because I think we still have such an old school mentality that lighter is always better in cycling. But every single year I see more and more people converting to want to use the aero frame over the climbing frame for races, just because the speed is so high now in racing.
Has anybody best bike split that? Like just a 300 grams to me is like, that's nothing. Like an empty water bottle is 100. So it's like throw a couple of gills out and you're good.
So I think I'm now testing my memory, but I think we get recommended to use the climbing bike once you go over about 8% in gradient on a climb. So if the final climb, for example, on the stage, an uphill finish was more than 8%, then they would recommend that you take the lighter option. But if it's less than 8%, then they would recommend you take the more aero option.
Interesting. I'd be curious if they thought of like the distance, the total distance, KJs as you were talking about before. Like, what am I going to feel like at the bottom of the climb? There's just so many variables. There's never going to be a perfect answer.
Yes. So before every stage in a Grand Tour, we get recommended a equipment setup, and this takes into account a lot of things. Like, for example, if it was a 200-kilometer stage and it was 185 kilometers pan flat, with then say a 9% climb for 10 kilometers, then they would probably still recommend the aero bike. But if it's a 150-kilometer stage with 4,000 meters of climbing, they would probably recommend the climbing bike.
I love that you guys like rattle off these numbers. 4,000 meters of climbing. It's like just such a crazy number. It's wild. Okay, what's kind of shifting gears here? What do you think is underrated in cycling training?
Enjoyment.
Oh, hell yeah. I don't think anybody's ever said that. That's amazing. That fits perfectly with your personality too. What's overrated then?
Suffering. No, uh,
Welcome to
what's
the dojo with Jack.
um, what's overrated? Complexity.
Okay. Yeah, no, that works. Is there anything that you've gone through off the bike that you had to overcome that you feel like has helped you become a better athlete? An athlete, it could be mountain biker, could be, or maybe just human, but just something that you're like, man, that really toughened me up.
Oh, I've had a couple rehabilitation processes with injuries that I've had, and that's always a little bit complicated and difficult because, especially when you're professional, your or cycling is more or less becomes your identity, and then when that sort of forcefully gets taken away with an injury, it can be quite hard mentally to deal with that time off, especially when you're seeing a lot of your friends or a lot of your competitors maybe doing well and you're kind of stuck on the sideline, not really being able to do anything. But if you can, it allows you to get an appreciation for something outside of cycling and something outside of the job. And I think that's kind of helped me along the way to find a bit of a healthy balance between me as a cyclist and me as a person.
I love that. And that's a tip that so many people that go through injuries will be able to kind of apply and remember. So there's someone that's going to hear that, and that definitely will motivate them to get through that period because it's not fun. So it's a Saturday, you've got a 5 or maybe a 7 hour ride on your calendar, and it's just pissing rain. What's your next move?
Check the weather forecast and change it for a sunny day.
Okay. So it's a day off. You're like, this is not happening. Are you getting on Zwift maybe, or is that not happening either?
Nah, so one of the luxuries we have as professionals is that it's our job, and generally we get pretty good at looking at weather apps and trying to adjust the training around the weather. So generally, I would try to avoid as much as possible to not have to do that training ride in the rain.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's unavoidable. And sometimes, yes, I will jump on the trainer and do an indoor workout, but I would definitely not do 5 hours indoors.
What's the max?
2 times 1.5 hours.
Are you splitting it up? Like you're getting off and taking
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. See, somebody just told me that's like the death move. They're like, whatever you do, don't try and get off once you get off. And I was like, what about peeing? They're like, if you pee, go pee and get back on, or else it's gonna be brutal. So now you're breaking that mold. I like this.
Yeah, no, I would do like an hour and a half before lunch, get off the bike, have the lunch, rest, hang out, wait. Maybe the weather gets better in the afternoon. You go outside. If it doesn't get any better, then maybe another hour and a half. But this is like max 3 hours total in one day on the trainer.
All right, I like that. So yeah, okay, then this is a good time for the bro science question. There's no data about something that you feel just makes you faster. Maybe something that you're even embarrassed to like, you're like, you know what, it's this special sandwich I've got, or it's the way I do this lift or whatever. Any bro science that you believe in?
Not really, to be honest. I'm trying to think, but I don't think there is very much bro science. Like I try not to have any kind of superstition or anything like this either. So I just try to keep it, yeah, pretty basic and pretty sciencey, I guess. And just
When you
like
said
the
this,
fundamentals.
yeah, when you said like the keeping things simple, I'm like, sometimes Jack probably just like cracks on and is not overly worried about all the minutia and minor details. So
Not really.
okay,
Not really.
cool, that's good. So besides your own podcast, what's the best piece of cycling content you've recently consumed?
Um, I listen to a few different cycling podcasts. One of them is the Lenton Rouge podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So Patrick Bro is quite a good friend of mine. I listen to his podcast. I listen to the Nero Show podcast every now and then. Some Australian guys.
Yeah.
And then obviously just some of the other Escape Collective podcasts I like listening to, like the Performance Process one is quite interesting to listen to. Also, I contribute a little bit of triathlon podcast. The shout out to another Australian guy. I think his name's also Jack. I think it's called the Triathlon Hour.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
I heard and it might be called Tri News. It's a big blue capital T, but that's where I heard, oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. The sports scientist from Bora Hansgrohe who came on
Dan Lorang.
nope. Young guy.
Uh,
Oh, This is
His
embarrassing. It
last
was like
name
6 months
Schwartz.
ago,
Ge-
but he had
Jer-
sorry, go ahead.
Jeremiah Jeremiah Swartz. Oh, okay, I
Nope.
don't know.
Yeah. Anyways, but that got me into it, and I was starting to think about maybe interviewing some duathletes who are like running and riding, and just keep it endurance based. Doesn't have to be cycling specific. All right, I want to respect your time. I got one last question for you. So we're coming out of Tenerife. Do you know, you had mentioned the tour, and do you know what the spring calendar is looking like, or how much of a lead up? Being a GC guy, do you get more heads up like, yo, you're doing the tour, you're doing the Vuelta, even though it's all the way out, months out, or is it still sort of a surprise? A lot of people come on like, dude, I don't know what I'm doing in 3 weeks. They're just going to tell me. How does that work for you, and what can you share, if anything, about your upcoming season?
So yeah, generally in most teams there'll be a bit of a priority list of the guys that they try to give the race calendar to, that it doesn't really change.
Mm-hmm.
But then, yes, some of the other guys, they sort of get a bit shuffled around into doing races that maybe they didn't want to do or they weren't planning to do. I'm quite lucky that I get given a race program in December, and then unless I get injured, I get sick, or something drastically happens, I generally end up doing 90 to 95% of that race calendar. So I more or less know the rest of my season from December.
So what's going to be cracking off this year for
Yep.
you?
So I generally follow a pretty typical race program that doesn't really change that much. So there's a 1-day race at the end of January. Then I do Vuelta Valencia, Paris-Nice, Pays Basco, Liège, Romandy, Dauphiné Tour.
Cool. No Vuelta?
Yeah, so then basically the way that it generally works in the World Tour is you sort of get your calendar up until the Tour de France, and then like everything kind of gets penciled in after the Tour because so much can change, and like it's so far away that it's sort of like, yeah, Vuelta's there in pencil, but you kind of wait until after the Tour or figure out what's happened, whether there's someone had a serious injury, if someone's really sick, or maybe you've got some sickness in this spring period, then your race calendar's changed, they want to add in more races afterwards. So yeah, after Tour de France is always sort of in pencil.
Where does a race like Liège sit in your heart of hearts? You just go because the team sends you there, or you want to crush these 1 days? I mean, it's obviously a huge race. Sorry, I don't know this. You have had at least one top 10, if not more.
Yeah, no, I think I've had one top 10 there. It's definitely a race that I enjoy, but when they changed the finish to being a flatter finish, it became less of a race that I could do well in. When I first started out, it was an uphill finish, which was a bit more suited to me, but now the finish has become more of a flatter, reduced bunch sprint, and I'm not the greatest sprinter.
Did not realize that. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Dude, this was awesome. So many gems. I appreciate you pulling the curtain back of what you're doing. I know you got a super busy week. Everybody definitely check out his podcast, but besides that, any other final words for the people that I might have missed or things on your mind?
Not really. I just hope everyone's kind of enjoyed this chat, and if you want some more, like I said, go check out the podcast, and yeah, that's about it. Thanks for having me on.
Jack, thank you for coming on. Actually, my last question. So the podcast, you're not on Strava, are you?
I put my races on Strava. So normally
Okay.
all my races will be public on Strava.
You're on Instagram. Are you tweeting, TikToking, blogging, any other ways to keep up?
Not really. Mostly the podcast is the thing that I do the most on social media. I do a tiny bit of Instagram, but not a whole lot. But yeah,
Okay.
mostly the podcast.
Sick. Dude, thank you so much. Everybody, be sure to check out the podcast. Good luck with your training and racing. We'll talk to you soon.